August 23rd, 1944, late afternoon, somewhere outside Falaise, Normandy. The German soldiers moved slowly toward the hedgerow with their hands raised, rifles left behind in the dust. They had been told exactly what would happen next. British captivity meant beatings, hunger, humiliation. That was what their officers said. That was what the leaflets warned about. Better to fight to the last bullet than fall into British hands. The men crossing the field expected shouting, rifle butts, fists. One of them flinched when a British sergeant stepped forward, but the blow never came. The sergeant spoke calmly, pointed to the ground, and motioned for them to sit. Another British soldier appeared with a canteen and handed it to the nearest prisoner without ceremony. No speech, no threats, just water. The Germans looked at each other, unsure whether this was a trick. They drank anyway. The British moved efficiently, searching pockets, collecting weapons, counting men. No one was struck. No one was insulted. A wounded German was pulled aside and treated immediately by a British medic who did not ask questions first. The prisoners waited for the second phase, the part where the cruelty would begin. It did not come. Instead, they were marched a short distance to a temporary holding area where more water appeared, then food. Not scraps. Actual rations. Bread. Meat. One prisoner later recalled thinking it was staged, meant to soften them up before the real treatment began. That belief lasted until nightfall. As darkness came down, the guards rotated, still calm, still distant, still professional. No reprisals, no revenge for bombed cities or dead civilians. The Germans lay awake listening for screams that never came. This moment was not unique. It was repeated thousands of times across North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. German soldiers surrendered expecting violence because they had been conditioned to expect it. Nazi propaganda had spent years insisting that British captivity was brutal, that surrender meant torture or slow death, that the enemy would treat German soldiers the way Germany treated its own prisoners. The fear was deliberate. It kept men fighting when logic said stop. It made surrender feel like betrayal not just of the state, but of survival itself. That fear did not evaporate instantly. Even after the first hours passed without incident, prisoners assumed the kindness was temporary. They told themselves it would change once they reached camps, once the guards rotated, once the British stopped pretending. What unsettled them most was not the absence of violence, but the absence of emotion. British guards did not gloat. They did not lecture. They did not appear interested in punishment at all. Orders were given clearly. Rules were enforced quietly. The prisoners were not treated as friends, but they were not treated as animals either. That neutrality was harder to process than cruelty would have been. Many of these men had spent years fighting in an army built on domination, hierarchy, and fear. Captivity, as they understood it, was supposed to reinforce that hierarchy in reverse. Instead, it felt procedural, controlled, almost administrative. As trucks arrived to transport them further back, one German NCO whispered that this must be temporary, that once they were out of sight of the front lines, the real treatment would begin. He was wrong. What the prisoners had just encountered was not an exception. It was the system. And for men who had been warned to expect violence, that realization would take much longer to arrive. The fear did not come from experience, it came from instruction. Long before most German soldiers ever saw a British uniform up close, they had been taught what British captivity would mean. From basic training onward, surrender was framed as something worse than death, especially to Western enemies portrayed as hypocritical and cruel beneath a civilized mask. Nazi propaganda was explicit about it. British guards were described as sadistic, eager to humiliate German prisoners, eager to starve them, eager to take revenge for bombing raids and colonial grudges. Pamphlets, briefings, and informal warnings reinforced the same message. The British smiled because they enjoyed what came next. Officers repeated it often enough that it hardened into certainty. It served a purpose. A soldier who believed surrender meant survival might choose it. A soldier who believed surrender meant suffering fought longer, even when the war was clearly lost. As the tide turned against Germany after 1942, this psychological barrier became more important, not less. The idea that the British followed rules was dismissed as naive. The Geneva Convention was portrayed as something Britain used when it suited them and ignored when it did not. German soldiers were reminded of Britain's empire, its prisons, its treatment of colonial subjects, selectively exaggerated and stripped of context to suggest that German prisoners would receive the same treatment. Rumours filled in the gaps where facts were absent. Men spoke of beatings during interrogation, of forced labour without food, of prisoners disappearing into camps and never being heard from again. None of these stories needed to be true to be effective. They needed only to be repeated. Even soldiers who privately doubted the regime absorbed the message because it aligned with fear. It explained why surrender felt wrong. It explained why capture was terrifying. It also explained why fighting on, even hopelessly, felt safer than laying down arms. By 1944, many German units in the West were exhausted, under-equipped, and aware that defeat was coming. The propaganda adapted. It no longer promised victory. It promised punishment if they gave up. British troops, they were told, would not forget the Blitz. They would not forgive. They would make examples. This belief followed German soldiers into surrender. It shaped how they walked toward British lines. It shaped how they raised their hands. It shaped how they interpreted every gesture in those first minutes of captivity. When no violence came, the absence itself felt suspicious. Kindness was not reassuring. It was unsettling. Men assumed it was temporary, a surface layer that would peel away once they were fully under control. They watched guards closely, waiting for signs of the cruelty they had been promised. A calm voice felt like restraint before anger. A shared cigarette felt like bait. Food felt like preparation for something worse. This mindset mattered because it meant British behaviour did not simply contradict expectation, it collided with it. The shock was not that the British were kind. It was that the entire mental framework German soldiers had relied on to understand surrender suddenly stopped working. For men conditioned to believe that enemies always behaved as they themselves had behaved, restraint made no sense. It did not fit the story they had been told about the world. And so, in those early hours and days of captivity, fear did not vanish. It lingered, reshaped, searching for confirmation that never came. The first hours passed without incident, and that was when the tension sharpened rather than eased. Once the initial shock of capture faded, German prisoners began watching for the turn. They assumed there would be one. In their experience, authority always asserted itself eventually. The delay felt deliberate, like the calm before punishment. Processing began methodically. Names were taken, units identified. Personal belongings were searched and recorded, not dumped or destroyed. Watches, letters, photographs were placed into labelled containers rather than pockets. This alone unsettled many prisoners. They had expected theft or casual humiliation. Instead, everything was accounted for, even items that could easily have been pocketed without consequence. Wounded men were separated first. British medics moved through the group quickly, checking bandages, reopening dressings that had been applied days earlier, cleaning wounds that were already infected. German prisoners were treated alongside British casualties, often with no distinction beyond urgency. Morphine was administered where necessary. No questions were asked about how the wound was received or how long the man had fought. Treatment came first. For many prisoners, this was the moment where the narrative truly cracked. German medical units late in the war were undersupplied and overstretched. Men had grown used to waiting, improvising, or going without. To be treated promptly by the enemy felt unreal. Several former POWs later described assuming the care was purely practical, meant to keep prisoners alive for interrogation. That explanation allowed them to maintain their expectations. The alternative was harder to accept. Food followed, Not a feast, not indulgent, but adequate and regular. British field rations were issued without comment. Bread, tinned meat, tea. It was more than many prisoners had eaten in days. The guards did not watch closely to see how it was consumed. They did not mock hunger or ration it as punishment. The act was transactional, almost indifferent. Language barriers were addressed without hostility. Guards used basic German phrases or called for interpreters. Instructions were repeated rather than shouted. Confusion was corrected, not punished. Men who misunderstood an order were repositioned physically, guided by the arm, not struck. These details accumulated. None of them were dramatic on their own. Together, they created unease. Temporary holding areas were functional. Makeshift camps behind the lines used tents, barns, or requisitioned buildings. Prisoners slept on straw or ground sheet, not bare earth. Guards rotated in shifts. There were rules, and they were enforced, but the enforcement was restrained. When a prisoner broke formation or spoke out of turn, the response was correction, not retaliation. The Germans waited for the interrogation phase. It came, but it did not resemble what they expected. Questioning was structured and limited. Name, rank, unit, serial number, the same information required by the Geneva Convention. There were no threats, no raised voices, no attempts to extract tactical secrets through force. Officers who attempted to volunteer information were stopped. The procedure was clear and narrow. This confused prisoners even more. Interrogation, as they understood it, was supposed to be invasive, painful, humiliating. The British approach felt almost disinterested. The questions ended quickly. Prisoners were returned to the group. No follow-up came. As night fell, the prisoners were moved again, this time further from the front. Trucks arrived. The men were loaded in without rough handling. Guards sat among them rather than looming over them. Cigarettes appeared. In some cases, guards shared their own. Conversation was minimal, but when it happened, it was mundane. Weather, distance, orders. Sleep came reluctantly. Many prisoners stayed awake, convinced that the true nature of captivity would reveal itself after dark. They listened for screams, for footsteps, for sudden commands. None came. The camp settled into quiet. By morning, a new fear replaced the old one. If this was real, if this treatment continued, then something else had been wrong all along. The enemy they had been taught to fear did not behave as expected. That realization was more destabilizing than brutality would have been. The first hours in British hands did not break German prisoners physically. They began breaking something else. The certainty that surrender meant cruelty. What the prisoners were experiencing was not improvisation. It was policy. Britain entered the war with a clear legal and administrative framework for handling prisoners of war, rooted in the 1929 Geneva Convention, which Britain had ratified and largely respected. That framework did exist to display moral superiority. It existed because British leadership believed discipline, predictability, and rule-based treatment produced control. Camps were organized, inspected, and regulated. Records were kept meticulously. The International Red Cross was granted access. Prisoners were registered, their families notified, and mail allowed under censorship. None of this was hidden from the Germans once they arrived in established camps. For men who had expected secrecy and abuse, transparency itself was unsettling. The British system assumed that prisoners who were treated according to rules were less likely to resist, less likely to sabotage, and easier to manage over long periods. Violence, British planners believed, created defiance and chaos. Order created compliance. Camps were run by officers trained not just in security, but in administration. Guards were instructed to maintain distance, not hostility. Discipline was enforced, but punishment was codified and limited. Solitary confinement existed, but beatings did not. Food rations for prisoners were tied to British civilian rations. meaning POWs often ate no worse than the population guarding them. This was not generosity, it was consistency. Britain was fighting a long war under rationing and believed that visibly starving prisoners while civilians went without would undermine domestic morale and international credibility. The system also assumed the war would end one day, and Britain would have to answer for how it behaved. That calculation mattered. German prisoners noticed that guards followed rules even when no one was watching. Orders were enforced the same way every day. Roll calls happened on schedule. Work details were organized and supervised. Complaints, when raised through proper channels, were sometimes addressed. Not always resolved, but acknowledged. This predictability reduced fear more effectively than kindness ever could. The absence of arbitrariness mattered. Many prisoners had lived under a regime where authority was personal, emotional, and often violent. British authority felt impersonal by comparison. It did not rage. It did not improvise punishments. It functioned like a system that expected compliance rather than obedience through fear. That difference reshaped captivity. Guards were not told to be friendly. They were told to be correct. Civilians near camps were discouraged from harassing prisoners. Revenge attacks were not tolerated. When incidents occurred, they were investigated internally. This was not because Britain lacked anger. British cities had been bombed. Civilians had been killed. Families had been displaced. The restraint was a choice. British officials understood that mistreating prisoners invited retaliation against British POWs held by Germany. Reciprocity was a constant concern. But beyond that, there was an institutional belief that cruelty weakened authority. German prisoners gradually realized that what they were seeing was not an act, not a temporary measure, and not dependent on individual guards. It was a system designed to function without hatred. That realization did not bring relief immediately. It brought confusion. A system that treated enemies as administrative problems rather than moral enemies challenged everything they had been taught about power, war, and victory. Routine did more to dismantle fear than any single gesture ever could. Once German prisoners were transferred to permanent camps in Britain, captivity settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal compared to what they had prepared themselves for. Days were structured. Wake-up calls came at the same time. Roll call followed. Meals arrived predictably. There was no sense of constant threat. No random inspections meant to intimidate. The wire was there, the guards were there, but the atmosphere was controlled rather than oppressive. Barracks were basic but functional. Wooden huts or converted buildings, heated when fuel allowed. Prisoners slept on bunks with blankets issued through standard supply channels. There was crowding in some camps, especially as prisoner numbers swelled after 1943, but it was not chaotic. Camps were inspected regularly, both by British authorities and by neutral observers from the Red Cross. Prisoners noticed this quickly. The idea that outsiders could walk through at any time reinforced the sense that what they were experiencing was not hidden. Food became one of the most persistent sources of shock. Rations were not luxurious, but they were sufficient. Bread, potatoes, soup, tea, sometimes meat, sometimes substitutes. Importantly, rations were consistent. They did not fluctuate as punishment. Many prisoners realized that they were eating roughly the same food, and sometimes more regularly than British civilians living under rationing. This created discomfort rather than gratitude. The enemy was not behaving like an enemy should. Work details became a central part of daily life. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, and Britain made extensive use of this provision. German POWs were sent to farms, construction sites, road crews, and forestry camps. Britain faced severe labour shortages as its own men served overseas, and prisoner labour became essential to keeping the economy functioning. For many Germans, this was the first sustained contact with British civilians. The fear they carried into these encounters was intense. They expected hostility, spitting, insults, or violence. Instead, most were treated with wary practicality. Farmers needed hands, crops needed harvesting, roads needed repairing. Civilians were instructed not to fraternize excessively, but in practice, human contact was unavoidable. Conversations happened, at first minimal, then longer. Weather, work, families. Some civilians offered tea. Others left food out deliberately, pretending not to notice when it was taken. Guards often looked the other way. These moments were not universal, but they were common enough to undermine the image of a population consumed by hatred. Within the camps, prisoners organized their own internal life. Sports leagues formed. Football matches drew crowds. Religious services were permitted. German chaplains operated openly. Educational classes emerged, sometimes encouraged by British authorities who saw value in keeping prisoners occupied. Libraries appeared. Prisoners read British newspapers under censorship, slowly absorbing a version of the war that differed sharply from what they had been told. Discipline still existed. Escape attempts were punished with confinement. Fights between prisoners were broken up. Nazi loyalists who tried to enforce ideology inside the camps were monitored and sometimes isolated. But punishment followed rules. It was predictable. That predictability mattered more than leniency. What unsettled prisoners most was how ordinary everything became. Guards were not monsters. Civilians were not raging mobs. The camps did not feel like places of vengeance. Over time, fear gave way to routine, and routine created space for thought. Men who had expected to spend captivity enduring abuse instead spent it enduring boredom. That boredom was dangerous in its own way. With immediate fear gone, questions surfaced. If British civilians treated them this way, what else had they been lied to about? If the enemy followed rules, why had their own leaders insisted otherwise? These questions did not arrive all at once. They crept in during long work days, quiet evenings, and conversations that should not have been possible. Daily life in British captivity did not break German prisoners physically. It did something far more lasting. It removed the constant pressure that kept belief systems intact, and in that absence, doubt began to grow. The moments that unsettled German prisoners most were rarely dramatic. They were small, unguarded, and impossible to explain away. A guard slipping a wounded prisoner an extra blanket without comment. A farmer correcting a neighbour who muttered an insult, reminding him that the man in front of them was there to work, not to be punished. A British officer stepping between prisoners and civilians after an air raid, ordering everyone back and making it clear that retaliation would not be tolerated. These were not acts designed for effect. They happened quickly, almost instinctively, and then life continued. For prisoners raised on the idea that power always revealed itself through domination, these moments were deeply disorienting. One former prisoner later recalled being assigned to a farm in eastern England during the harvest. The farmer's son had been killed in North Africa the year before. The prisoner expected hostility the moment he learned this. Instead, the farmer said nothing. Work began at dawn. At midday, food was brought out and shared evenly. No speeches, no looks of accusation, just routine. The absence of confrontation felt heavier than anger would have. Another account described a guard intervening during a village encounter. A local woman had begun shouting at a group of prisoners after news of bombing reached the area. Before the situation escalated, the guard ordered the prisoners back to the truck and then turned on the civilians, not gently, but firmly. He reminded them that these men were under British protection. The prisoners heard every word. That detail mattered. Protection was not something they expected the enemy to offer. Even inside the camps, the cracks appeared. British officers occasionally shut down mistreatment initiated by other prisoners. Nazi loyalists who tried to enforce discipline through intimidation found themselves isolated, not empowered. When violence occurred, it was addressed administratively rather than emotionally. Investigations were conducted. Consequences followed. The system responded in ways that felt impersonal, but fair. These moments forced prisoners to confront an uncomfortable realization. The kindness was not dependent on sympathy. It did not disappear when emotions ran high. It was structural. Guards were not encouraged to be friendly, but they were expected to be professional. That professionalism created boundaries that could not be crossed casually. When guards broke those rules, they were corrected. Prisoners noticed that too. Authority restrained itself. For men who had grown up under a regime where power was performative and unpredictable, this restraint felt unnatural. In the German system, authority proved itself through excess. British authority proved itself through control. The effect was cumulative. One incident could be dismissed as an exception. Dozens could not. Over time, prisoners began comparing stories: the absence of beatings, the consistency of food, the way guards responded to complaints, the fact that letters home were delivered, the fact that parcels arrived. These details contradicted everything they had been told. The enemy was not behaving incorrectly by accident. It was behaving deliberately. This realization did not lead to immediate gratitude. It led to suspicion. Prisoners searched for the hidden cost. They assumed there must be one. Some believed the British were playing a long game, softening them for interrogation or political manipulation. Others waited for the moment when the mask would slip. It did not. Instead, the longer captivity lasted, the more mundane the behavior became. Guards changed shifts. Civilians came and went. Seasons passed. The restraint remained. The shock shifted from disbelief to something quieter. Acceptance, followed by discomfort. Because if the British were capable of this kind of restraint, then the moral framework the prisoners had relied on to justify the war no longer held. The enemy was not barbaric. The enemy was organized, calm, and often indifferent. That indifference hurt more than hatred would have. It forced prisoners to re-evaluate not just who the British were, but who they themselves had been fighting for. The moments that broke the narrative were never meant to. They simply happened, and in doing so, they dismantled years of conditioning without raising a hand. The restraint became more striking when measured against what Britain had endured. German prisoners did not arrive in Britain unaware of the damage their country had inflicted. They saw the bombed rail yards as they were transported inland. They passed through cities where entire streets were missing, reduced to foundations and brick dust. In London, Coventry, Liverpool, and dozens of smaller towns, the evidence was impossible to miss. Roofs torn away, churches gutted, factories blackened and silent, British civilians living among ruins that were not accidents but targets. Many prisoners expected this to be where the anger surfaced. If revenge was coming, this was where it would make sense. Instead, restraint hardened. British authorities understood the risk. POW transports passed through communities that had lost family members in air raids. Camps were built near towns that had been bombed repeatedly. The possibility of reprisals was real. That was precisely why policy mattered. Civilians were warned explicitly that prisoners were under British protection. Any violence against them would be prosecuted. Guards were instructed to intervene decisively if emotions ran high. And they did. There were moments when tempers flared. After news of heavy bombing, insults were shouted, stones were thrown. These incidents did not escalate because the system moved quickly to contain them. Prisoners were removed from volatile areas. Civilians were dispersed. Responsibility was enforced. The restraint did not come from lack of feeling. It came from discipline. German prisoners noticed this distinction. Britain had reasons to be cruel. It chose not to be. The contrast grew sharper as the war dragged on. As British casualties mounted, as news from the front brought lists of the dead, the treatment of prisoners did not change. Rations remained steady. Work assignments continued. Mail continued to flow. There was no moment where the system hardened in response to loss. This consistency challenged the prisoners' assumptions more than kindness ever could. Cruelty would have confirmed the story they had been told. Restraint under pressure contradicted it completely. Some prisoners attempted to rationalize what they were seeing. They argued among themselves that Britain could afford restraint because it was winning. That explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Much of this treatment had begun when Britain's position was far from secure. Others suggested that Britain behaved this way for propaganda purposes. That too failed to explain why guards acted the same when no one was watching. The more perceptive prisoners began to recognize something uncomfortable. British restraint was not weakness, it was confidence. A state unsure of its legitimacy needs to assert itself constantly. A state confident in its authority can afford to limit itself. Britain did not need to prove its power through prisoners. It had already done so on the battlefield. This realization reframed captivity. The camps were no longer places of waiting for punishment. They were places where power was exercised quietly. That kind of power was harder to resist. There were rules, and those rules were enforced, not emotionally, administratively. For prisoners raised in a system where power flowed from ideology and fear, this was alien. British authority did not demand belief. It demanded compliance, and it offered stability in return. The restraint extended beyond physical treatment. German POWs were not subjected to forced ideological confessions. There were no loyalty rituals, no public humiliations. When re-education programs were later introduced, they focused on exposure rather than coercion. Prisoners were shown films, given newspapers, allowed to argue among themselves. The absence of force in these efforts mattered. Ideas encountered voluntarily carry more weight than those imposed. By choosing restraint, even when it had every excuse not to, Britain created a contrast that prisoners could not ignore. The war they had been told was a struggle against barbarism now looked increasingly like something else. A confrontation between systems with very different assumptions about power, control, and legitimacy. That realization did not arrive suddenly. It crept in over months and years, reinforced by every ordinary interaction that failed to turn violent. In the end, what unsettled German prisoners most was not how Britain treated them, but how little Britain needed to prove itself in doing so. As months turned into years, captivity stopped feeling temporary, and that was when the deeper shift began. For many German prisoners in Britain, the end of the war in May 1945 did not bring immediate release. Britain was exhausted, short of labour, and responsible for hundreds of thousands of prisoners who could not simply be sent back into a shattered Germany. Camps remained open. Work details continued. The wire stayed up. This prolonged captivity forced prisoners to confront a reality they could no longer explain away as wartime theatre. Britain had won. There was no longer any strategic reason to pretend. And yet, the treatment did not change. Instead, something new appeared. Education programs expanded. Lectures were offered on history, politics, and economics. Prisoners were given access to uncensored newspapers and magazines under supervision. Films were shown, not as punishment or propaganda rallies, but as material to be discussed. For men raised in a system where information was controlled tightly and disagreement punished, this was destabilizing. They were not told what to think, they were shown how others thought. The effect was uneven. Some prisoners rejected it outright, others engaged cautiously. But the exposure worked slowly, not by force, but by erosion. British officials understood that years of ideology would not be undone by arguments. Instead, they relied on time and contrast. Prisoners saw how British society functioned under strain. They saw civilians still following rules, still criticizing their own government openly, still disagreeing without fear. They noticed that guards complained about rations and weather just like prisoners did. Authority no longer appeared distant or mythical. It looked human. This mattered because it reframed defeat. German prisoners had been taught that losing meant annihilation or humiliation. What they experienced instead was containment without destruction. For some, this was harder to accept than brutality would have been. It left no clear enemy to hate. Over time, Boredom replaced fear, and boredom created space for reflection. Men who had never questioned orders began questioning narratives. Conversations inside the camps changed. Early discussions focused on survival and rumors. Later ones focused on responsibility. Who had lied? Who had known? Who had chosen to believe? British restraint did not absolve the prisoners of guilt, but it removed the external pressure that kept self-examination at bay. The longer captivity lasted, the more personal the reckoning became. Some prisoners admitted, quietly at first, that what they had been told about Britain had been false. Others struggled with shame, not because they had been mistreated, but because they had expected to be. That expectation forced them to confront what they themselves had been prepared to do to others. When release finally came for many in the late 1940s, it was not accompanied by triumph or celebration. Prisoners left Britain carrying complex emotions. Relief, certainly. Gratitude, sometimes. But also disorientation. They were returning to a country physically destroyed and morally shaken, having spent years inside a system that had treated them with restraint they had not believed possible. That contrast did not fade quickly. For some, it lasted a lifetime. The shock of British captivity was not a single moment. It was a slow realization, stretched across years, that the enemy they had feared most behaved in ways their own system never had. When the prisoners finally returned home, many discovered that the most difficult part of captivity began after it ended. They stepped back into Germany carrying stories that did not fit the ruins around them. Families expected tales of brutality. Neighbors expected confirmation of what they had been told for years. Some wanted reassurance that the enemy had been as cruel as promised, that suffering had been universal and unavoidable. Instead, many former prisoners hesitated. What they had experienced did not match the narrative anyone wanted to hear. Those who spoke honestly often found themselves isolated. To say that British guards had been fair, that civilians had been restrained, that captivity had been ordered rather than violent, sounded almost like betrayal. In a country struggling to process defeat, restraint from the enemy complicated grief. It did not absolve guilt, it removed excuses. Memoirs written decades later reflect this tension. Former POWs rarely described British captivity as easy. It was boring, confining, humiliating in its own way. But again and again, the same detail appeared. They had expected violence, they had prepared for it, and it never came. That absence became the defining memory. Some former prisoners maintained contact with Britain. A number returned as civilians years later, visiting farms where they had worked, writing letters to guards who had treated them fairly. These were not gestures of gratitude in the simple sense. They were attempts to reconcile a contradiction that never fully resolved. The enemy had behaved in ways that undermined everything the prisoners had been taught about power and morality. Others carried the experience quietly. They did not romanticize it. They did not excuse their own actions or the war itself. But they could not forget that, at the moment they expected to be destroyed, they were instead contained. That difference mattered. British policy toward German POWs did not end the war sooner. It did not erase the devastation Germany had inflicted. But it did something less visible and more lasting. It exposed a gap between propaganda and reality that many prisoners could never fully close again. The war they thought they were fighting did not exist in the way they had believed. For Britain, the treatment of prisoners rarely became a source of pride. It was not advertised as a moral victory. It was simply how the system functioned. British officials saw it as adherence to law, discipline, and long-term stability. Guards saw it as a job. Civilians saw it as something that had to be managed carefully in a wounded society. There was no grand gesture. That was the point. For the prisoners, however, the effect was profound. They had expected hatred and found order. They had expected vengeance and found procedure. They had expected cruelty and found restraint. None of this made captivity pleasant. It made it disorienting. In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt and tried to understand what had happened, these stories surfaced slowly. They did not dominate public memory, but they persisted. In interviews, letters, and family conversations, former prisoners described a version of the enemy that did not fit simple categories. Britain had defeated them militarily. It had not tried to break them personally. That distinction mattered because it left room for something else to grow. Not forgiveness in every case, not admiration, but recognition. Recognition that power could be exercised without cruelty, that authority could function without terror, that restraint was not weakness. For men who had been taught that the world operated only through domination, that realization lingered. Long after the camps were gone, British captivity did not redeem the war, it did not erase responsibility, but it forced thousands of German soldiers to confront a reality they had been shielded from, that their expectations had been shaped by fear, and that fear had been deliberately manufactured. The shock was not that Britain treated them well. The shock was that it did not need to treat them badly at all.